The Cold War, which lasted from 1947 to 1991, was a period of intense rivalry between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, following the end of World War II. Unlike traditional wars, the Cold War was not fought through direct military conflict between the two powers. Instead, it was marked by political, ideological, economic, and military tensions, with both sides trying to spread their influence across the globe. At the end of World War II, the world was divided into two major blocs: the capitalist, democratic United States and its allies, and the communist, authoritarian Soviet Union and its allies. This division was primarily ideological, with the US advocating for democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union promoted communism and a single-party state. This ideological divide was the root cause of the Cold War. The tensions began to mount immediately after World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union were once allies in the fight against Nazi Germany, but their partnership quickly dissolved as they had conflicting visions for the post-war world. The Soviets wanted to expand their influence across Europe and beyond, while the US sought to contain communism and promote democratic governance. One of the early flashpoints of the Cold War was the division of Germany. At the Yalta and Potsdam conferences in 1945, the Allies decided to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones, controlled by the US, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. However, tensions over how to handle post-war Europe grew, especially regarding Berlin, which was located deep in the Soviet-controlled Eastern Zone. The Berlin blockade in 1948, where the Soviet Union cut off access to West Berlin, was one of the first major crises of the Cold War. The US and its allies responded with the Berlin airlift, delivering supplies to the people of West Berlin by air, which became a symbol of defiance against Soviet control. Another significant aspect of the Cold War was the nuclear arms race. Both the US and the Soviet Union developed massive stockpiles of nuclear weapons, with the threat of mutual assured destruction, MAD, hanging over the world. The US had used atomic bombs on Japan in 1945, and in 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear bomb, setting off a dangerous arms race. Both sides built ever more powerful weapons, creating a constant fear of nuclear war, but also a delicate balance of power where neither side wanted to risk a direct confrontation. While direct military conflict between the US and the Soviet Union was avoided, the Cold War was marked by a number of proxy wars fought in third-party countries. The US and the Soviet Union supported opposing sides in conflicts like the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, and the Afghan-Soviet War, 1979 to 1989. These wars were extensions of the Cold War, as both superpowers sought to expand their influence by supporting aligned governments or revolutionary movements. In addition to military conflicts, the Cold War also extended into the realm of science and technology. One of the most iconic aspects of the Cold War was the space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into space. This stunned the US, which quickly responded by launching its own satellite, Explorer 1, in 1958. The space race became a symbol of the technological competition between the two superpowers. The US eventually won the space race with the successful landing of Apollo 11 on the Moon in 1969. But the space competition continued for decades. Culturally, the Cold War also played a significant role. Both sides used propaganda to promote their ideologies and to cast the other side in a negative light. The US portrayed itself as the defender of freedom and democracy, while the Soviet Union presented itself as the champion of the working class and anti-imperialism. The ideological conflict was also reflected in cultural exports, such as films, literature, and music, with both sides trying to showcase their way of life as superior to the other. Ultimately, the Cold War began to wind down in the late 1980s. The Soviet Union, facing economic difficulties and a growing desire for reform, began to lose its grip on Eastern Europe. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, a physical symbol of the divide between the East and the West, fell. The Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991, marking the official end of the Cold War. Despite the fact that the Cold War never turned into a full-scale hot war, it had a profound impact on world history. The geopolitical landscape of the world was shaped by this rivalry, with many countries caught in the middle and the threat of nuclear war lingering for decades. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War brought about a new era in international relations. But the tensions between the US and Russia, though less intense, continue to shape global politics to this day. Now imagine if the Cold War had turned hot, if a direct military conflict had occurred between the superpowers. What would the world have looked like? Would we have survived such a devastating war? If the Cold War had turned into a hot war, it's likely that the first major battleground would have been Europe, specifically Germany. The Berlin Wall, which divided East and West, stood as a physical symbol of the ideological conflict between the capitalist West and the communist East. If both sides had escalated into war, it's conceivable that the Soviet Union would have pushed for total control of Berlin and the rest of West Germany. The US would have been forced to respond, and the possibility of a full-scale war in Europe would have been imminent. Nuclear weapons, which both superpowers had amassed in enormous numbers, would have played a central role in this conflict. With both the US and the Soviet Union possessing massive stockpiles of nuclear bombs, a hot Cold War would have immediately raised the threat of nuclear warfare. The concept of mutually assured destruction, MAD, had prevented a hot war during the Cold War, but in this alternate scenario, this deterrent would have been put to the test. A nuclear exchange would likely have resulted in catastrophic destruction across Europe and beyond, with massive civilian casualties and long-term environmental damage. The war would have also spilled into other parts of the world. Proxy wars, such as those in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, would have turned into direct battlegrounds. The US and the Soviet Union would have sent large numbers of troops into these regions, engaging in brutal and destructive combat. The Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia would have become primary theaters for the Cold War's hot conflict, potentially reshaping the borders and political systems of these regions forever. On the home front, the impact would have been profound. Both the US and the Soviet Union would have mobilized their populations for war. Governments would have imposed rationing, drafted millions of young men, and shifted their economies entirely toward the war effort. The everyday lives of citizens would have been drastically altered as both sides engaged in total warfare. Cities would have been bombed, economies would have collapsed, and entire generations would have been lost in the conflict. The global balance of power would have shifted dramatically. In the aftermath of such a war, the world would have seen a dramatic reordering of its political and economic structures. The United States, which had emerged from World War II as the preeminent superpower, might have suffered severe losses that would have prevented it from maintaining its global influence. The Soviet Union, though it possessed a vast nuclear arsenal, may have been unable to overcome the sheer industrial might of the US and its allies, leading to a potential collapse or weakening of the Soviet regime. In this alternate timeline, many of the international institutions that exist today, such as the United Nations, NATO, and the European Union, may not have had the chance to form or could have been fundamentally altered. The global landscape would have been far more fragmented, with power struggles taking place between newly formed coalitions and nations struggling to recover from the devastation of a global war. The Cold War's hot version would have likely altered the course of technological progress as well. The space race, which was a direct result of Cold War rivalry, might have been abandoned in favor of military innovation. Space exploration, scientific advancements, and technological breakthroughs would have taken a back seat to the urgent needs of war. The devastation caused by a hot-cold war would have set back global progress by decades, if not centuries. Ultimately, a hot-cold war would have irrevocably changed the course of history. The Cold War as we know it, a prolonged period of tension and rivalry without direct military conflict, served as a time when the world was on the edge of disaster, but managed to avoid it. However, had the conflict erupted into war, it would have left a scar on the world that would have taken generations to heal. The future we know today might have been unrecognizable, and humanity's path forward could have been marked by the long-lasting consequences of a global catastrophe. In this alternate reality, the legacy of the Cold War would have been far more destructive, reshaping the world in unimaginable ways. The ideological battle between capitalism and communism would have left the world irreparably divided, and the scars of war would have shaped every aspect of life for generations to come. The world's future, which in this timeline was defined by gradual improvement and cooperation, might have been marked by a long period of recovery, rebuilding, and political upheaval. The Cold War turning hot would have created a world that was far less stable, far more dangerous, and far less connected than the one we live in today. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into alternate history scenarios, and be sure to hit the bell icon to never miss an exciting new video.